Hi, and welcome to our preparatory video on the course History of English 2, English and its Germanic Relatives. By this video, I'm opening the second week of our blog on modern English. I'm first going to shortly summarize the Great Vowel Shift, and then I'm going to talk about how standardizing a language became one of the central issues for the early modern English speakers. I'm going to talk about the so-called standard language ideology, and I'm going to give you two examples of this ideology. First, the use of early modern English pronouns by the Quakers, and the so-called group genitive. At the end of this video, I'm going to explain what you should concentrate on while working with the handout for our next session. Right, so the Great Vowel Shift. So as we discussed last week, English undergone a massive change in pronunciation in the early modern English period, the so-called Great Vowel Shift. It basically affected long vowels, and the long vowels were either raised, meaning they shifted to a higher position in the phonological system, or if a raising was not possible, such as with the long E and the long U, then those sounds turned into diphthongs. So E turned into an I and U turned into an OW. This is a process that did not happen overnight, and it took almost 3 centuries to complete. So it started approximately in the middle of the 15th century and ended during the 19th century. And this is also one of the sound shifts that really differentiates English from its continental Germanic relatives. Now, if you remember last time, we discussed how people such as John Hart, but also others like William Bullockar, tried to standardize the spelling. They were aware of the fact that the English spelling of that time did not really reflect the way people pronounce the words. So there was a series of spelling reforms. All of them were eventually not successful, but the idea was that the way people used to write their language is not optimal, and people should use a better way of writing their language. This idea that language and the writing and so forth is supposed to be standardized, that people should, that there are ways to use the language and ways of using the language that is not preferred. This did not only affect spelling, but also, for example, grammar. One of the very famous people who tried to standardize the rules of grammar in that time was, for example, this person, Robert Lowth. He wrote a series of prescriptive grammars in which he introduced rules that are actually still familiar to us nowadays. One of them is the so-called preposition stranding. Here is a passage from his grammar where he explains that using sentences such as "the house I live in" is less preferred than sentences such as "the house in which I live." Or another thing that is very much still present in our ideas about language today, the idea that two negatives sort of destroy one another, to use Lowth's words. And that two negatives should not be used. it was not only grammar and spelling, it was also vocabulary. Persons such as someone such as Samuel Johnson, who is famous for his English dictionary of the English language from 1755, tried to write down all of the different words in English and describe their correct meaning. I'm not sure whether you've heard about Samuel Johnson, but you've very much, you very likely are to know him from memes, right? Memes that are also very often used in a prescriptive manner. For example, this meme that explains to you that a lot is not a word, it should be a lot, right? Written separately. And when we talk about standardizing the language, it was not only something that single people did, it was also something that was the task of institutions. The first one of these institutions was founded in Florence, in Italy, in 1583, and was the so-called Accademia della Crusca, an institution that tried to standardize the Italian language. Similarly, in Germany, in Weimar, in 1617, we have the Fruchtbringende Gesellschaft, also an institution whose aim was to standardize the German language. This one was disbanded in 1663, but others, such as the famous Académie Française, founded in 1635, was successful, and this is also an institution, an academy that still exists in France and tries to control how the language is used and tries to give people guidelines about what not to use and what to use in their everyday use. Okay, so when we have this idea that there were obviously many people who tried to standardize their language, and behind this idea that, or behind these proposals to standardize a language, lies something that is called standard language ideology. By ideology, I don't necessarily mean something political, but simply ideas about language. And I'm sure that at least some of these things that I'm going to talk about in a second are still familiar to you now. So, at the core of the standard language ideology is the idea that there is one standard variety. This is a variety of a language that is prestigious, and people who speak that variety are prestigious as well, right? But the thing is, no variety is actually inherently prestigious. There is no linguistic basis for something like that. What very often happens is that the speakers of a variety, regardless of what variety that is, if those speakers are perceived as having high prestige, then the language is also viewed as being prestigious. So there is this interconnectedness between the prestige of the speakers and the prestige of their variety. Another thing that is very often associated with a standard variety is that this variety is stable, it's invariable. Standard variety is supposed to be static, solid, not changing. This is something that should always be as it is. Whereas non-standard varieties, dialects, sociolects, or the way people use language in their everyday lives is seen as unstable. This is also connected to the idea that the standard variety is there for formal uses. It's the variety that we carefully use. Whereas non-standard varieties, dialects, and other non-standardized ways of speaking are seen as informal, sloppy, and therefore also not prestigious. And standardization, the process of standardizing a language, is basically a process by which we impose uniformity upon a class of heterogeneous objects. In this case, varieties of words or grammatical rules and so forth. And it is important to know when we talk about these things that this is an ideology, a set of ideas. They can be implicit or explicit. And they are also very often in the form of biases, things that we sort of subconsciously like or dislike, and then try to make these biases, try to impose our biases and our ideas about how language and languages should look like. We try to impose those on the speech of everyone else. This is basically the idea of standardization. Another thing is this axiomatic nature of the standard variety. The standard variety is very often seen as correct, and it is seen as correct according to the common sense. We don't really, nobody proposing a standard variety has to really justify why that variety should be the standard one. It's according to the so-called common sense that the standard variety is the standard. Right? And one of these things is, in English, for example, the idea that it's more correct to use it is I who something something rather than it is me, right? The latter variant, it is I, is seen as correct because it's the standard one. And it's not really important how often, how frequently the incorrect, in inverted commas, form is being actually used, right? So the idea is that standard language is correct regardless of other factors. And you also have, this is from a, right, from 1998, from someone writing to a newspaper and complaining about the use of language. And this person, Bernard Richards, not important, says there is not much of a future for any language if it is left exclusively in the hands of the careless and the ignorant. Right? So this is also one part of this idea about standard language, that there should be some elite group, be it an institution or some other authorities, that should care about the language and should somehow correct it. And the idea that the standard language should be defended against, in the words of Bernard Richards, against the careless and the ignorant, because they could somehow corrupt the language, damage it, whatever. But this is also something that we'll see also in the early modern debate as well. Also, if you, for example, if you take a look at Facebook, Twitter, whatever social platform, and take a look at discussions when people talk about their ideas about language, you'll see that the idea of standard language and how the language is supposed to look like is definitely nothing that is only limited to the 18th, 17th century, right? So you have here, for example, I've made it all anonymous, but here someone's saying that English should bring back ye for fixed because it makes for clearer grammar than man sees now. Right? Someone else says that, or they continue to say that English is a mess. Right? Again, the idea that standard language is correct, right? Nicely organized, whereas if people simply speak as they like, it's a mess. It's chaotic. Right? And also the idea that if you use the language, remember what I talked about a minute ago when I talked about prestige, it also works the other way. And people who use non-standard language are seen as having, to quote this Facebook user, shoddy mindset, right? So that language and your cognitive capabilities are somehow connected. And another thing that is very common is to see the decay of language, right? Sort of to equal language change with language decay. Here, this user says, English is especially sloppy due to not being English for the best deal of 800 years and accepted needless word infusions from elsewhere that rot the morphology of the given tongue, right? So the idea that there is foreign influence that corrupts the language, that rots morphology, whatever, right? But the idea is always, regardless of the language and regardless of the time, actually, when such a quote is uttered, it's always somewhere back in the past, when the language was perfect, or at least close to perfect. Okay, so what we've seen is that, right, the past, the older, the better, basically. Again, equation of language use and cognitive abilities. The idea that the way people speak their language nowadays is somehow chaotic, not organized, and, to quote the person, a mess. And also, what's very often the case with standard language ideology is that foreign influence is bad. Loan words are bad, and we should all strive to integrate loan words into the language. These things. Okay, so we've talked theoretically about standardizing the language and about the standard language ideology. So now let's have a look at how this standard language ideology looks like in the use of pronouns by the Quakers in the early modern English period. Okay, so if you remember from our session before Christmas, we talked about the fact that in Middle English there was, for the second person, singular and plural, there was a distinct set of pronouns. There was thou, thee, thy for the singular, and ye, you, your for the plural. In early modern English, and also in present-day English, we only have one singular, we have one form for the singular and the plural, right? So you can be singular and plural. And there is basically no politeness distinction in this system, only very few archaic uses of the pronoun thee, thou, right? Bible, or if you want to sound very archaic or very formal. Okay. So the idea is that, so what happened is basically that the forms for the plural were generalized for the singular as well. And this is, and it's not only plural to singular, but it's also the dative case, the object form you, that got generalized, and not the nominative subject form ye, right? The reasons for that can be different. This could also be a topic for a term paper, but this is really something that is weird, and you might imagine that people at that time, 18th century, 17th century, were not all happy about this change. You can see something similar when you have a look at discussions about, if you take a look at the contemporary discussions of the use of the so-called singular they, right? Also a pronoun that was originally used only for plural and now is used also for singular. And something similar happened during the early modern English period for the second person. Right. And if we take a look at grammar books from that time, 18th century, for example, we might see something like this. It is customary among us, as likewise among the French and others, to speak but one particular person, to use the plural number. But then we say you and not ye. And if anyone speaks to another in the singular number, as thou Thomas, it is reckoned a sign of contempt or familiarity. Right? So you see that people at that time were aware of the fact that there is this distinction between, or there was this distinction between thou and you, but thou was seen as being less polite. Right? And this grammar book then has a series of questions and answers, and one of the questions is, what words are of the second person? And then the answer is, thou is of the second person singular, and ye or you of the second person plural. But then this person, James Greenwood, says, but we use you when we speak only to one person. How can that be then of the plural number? And the answer of the grammarian is, custom has made us do so. The verb that is put to it is always of the plural number, for we say you love, which is the plural, and not you lovest, which is the singular. And it is counted ungenteel and rude to say thou dost so and so. Right? So again, you see here that in this grammar book or essay text, the grammarian James Greenwood actually recognizes that the language is changing, and he describes here how people use the language, that it used to be something else, but now the language use has changed. This was not the case for the majority, or not for everyone. And in particular, there was one group of people who were very much opposed against this, were opposed to this change of using plural pronouns for singular. One of these groups were the Quakers, a religious society of Friends known as Quakers. Their founder, George Fox, right, born in lived throughout the second half of the 17th century. And he was, among other things, opposed to wars, opposed to military service, slavery, alcohol, swearing, oaths, and so forth. But he also said that for religious and egalitarian reasons, the use of singular you, right, so the use of you for single persons, is something that should not be used. And that if you talk to a single person, you should use thee. If you talk to more than one person, you should use you. He was in favor of what he called plain speaking, no politeness. And the Quakers, by the way, is an society, religious society that still exists, and they were actually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1947. But definitely not for their ideas about the use of pronouns. So this George Fox wrote in 1660 a text called A Battledore for Teachers, in which he explained why his arguments against the use of the singular you. So he explains like this: the Spirit of God also, which leads to one and to divide and distinguish singular from plural, many things from one thing, and one from two and three, and many men and women from one, and the many words from one, and the many gods from one, and the true Christ from the many antichrists and false. And that in all the monthly meetings there be an inquiry whether any who profess truth are out of the pure language, thou to everyone, whether they keep up God and Christ's language, which the holy prophets and apostles used over all the flattering words in the world. So what he says here basically is that the use of the same the use of the same pronoun for the plural and for the singular is something that goes against God, against the idea of religion. And also, he says here the thing in bold in the second quote, the pure language, right, should be using thou to everyone, right, not using politeness. Again, this idea, pure language, right? And another part of this standard language ideology, that that there is a pure way of speaking a language and other ways of speaking are impure, rotten, whatever. Right, and he goes on in this text that that children should also not be taught the use of you to a single person, and so forth. He's very passionate about this topic. Okay, but what he was quite obviously not successful, at least in the general public, but within the Quaker society, the Quaker groups, he was actually successful, and the Quakers, I think, used the singular thou very long after it was not a normal way of using pronouns in the general society anymore. Right. And what we have from George Fox is not only this pamphlet against using of the pronouns, but also his journals. Right, so he wrote a journal, and he wrote the following passage when he met a woman. And afterwards I passed away through the country, and at night came to an inn, and there was a rude company of people, and I asked the woman if she had any meat to bring me some. And she was something strange, because I said thee and thou to her. And right, so again, you see here that he describes here a situation when he met someone and he disrespected basically the standard language use at that time, meaning using you when you speak to someone. And he said thee, thou to her, and the person, to quote him, was something strange. Then another incident when George Fox met a judge, and he wrote the following: and before I was brought in, before the guard said, it was well if the justice was not drunk before we came to him, for he used to be drunk very early. And when I was brought before him, because I did not put off my hat and said thou to him, he asked the man whether I was not mazed or fawned. Right? So again, this is a harsher reaction, right? So George Fox was against formalities, against politeness, and he also, and this way of speaking produced this reaction by him in the judge, who asked whether George Fox was mad or imbecile because of his language use. Okay, and now let's have a look at the last topic, the group genitives. Okay, so in the English of the 18th, 17th, 18th century, what you sometimes find are constructions such as the following. Purchase his pilgrims in 5 books. Sejanus his fall, a tragedy. Ignatius his conclave, and so forth. And those are book titles. Right, so what you would normally expect would simply be the so-called Saxon genitive, the S, right? So purchases, pilgrims, Sejanus' fall, Ignatius's conclave, and so forth. But there, for a limited amount of time, we see this construction with his, sometimes also her, genitive. And the question is, what is this? Is it an orthographic innovation, or is it a change in the language? And if we take a look at other Germanic languages, we'll see that they actually have a very comparable construction as well. For all of you who speak German, a variety of German that you speak might have this construction. Meinem Bruder sein Auto, right? My brother his car, meaning the car of my brother. This is also possible in Dutch. Mijn broer zijn auto. Again, my brother his car. And also in Afrikaans, the daughter language of Dutch, right? So mijn broer zijn auto is the standard way of using the genitive in Afrikaans. We also know that Old English had this construction as well. In Old English, we had his, her, their genitive. In early modern English, we see that his genitives are more frequent than her genitives, but that's probably because there is no contraction of her to er, as it is from his to s, right? So you can, there is nothing like marry her house instead of marry her house, and there is also not something, you can't argue that the s in John's house would be John his house, right? So the s clearly favors the his genitive. But her genitives also exist, and they are probably constructed in analogy to his genitives. What also played a role here was probably something that is called hypercorrection, right? So in Middle English and early modern English, we have something that's called the H, the dropping of the H. We also talked about that last week, right? In words such as our or herb, the H is written but not pronounced. And so this is probably the S in the possessive construction, such as my brother's car. The S might have been reinterpreted as a contraction of his, my brother, his car. But probably all of these factors play a role, or played a role. So what we probably can see in these constructions in early modern English is the reinterpretation of the S in Ignatius's conclave to something like Ignatius his conclave, right? Also, if you say Ignatius us conclave, right, and combine it with the fact that you know that sometimes the letter H is written but not pronounced, you might come to the conclusion that you should write the H in Ignatius his conclave, even though you are not pronouncing the H really. Right, so as a speaker of early modern English, you might be aware of the fact that sometimes the H is not pronounced but written, and you try to compensate that. So you know that sometimes you are supposed to write an H even though you don't really say it, and this might be the case of this his genitive, that it's not really pronounced but nevertheless written. A case of hypercorrection. And this might seem like it's a strange thing, but a similar thing actually happens in present-day English as well. Something that I would call a pronunciation-based orthographic reanalysis. An example of this would be the way of spelling have as of, right? So you have a sentence such as I should have told you earlier, right? So the first line tells you how it's supposed to be written. But if you pronounce it actually like I should have told you earlier, right? Similar to as of, in terms of, and so forth. And if you have something that sounds like of, you might actually write it as of, of. And this way you actually arrive at the spelling I should have told you earlier, right? This is, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, but this is a way of writing should have, the contracted version of have, in informal written contexts on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. And it basically affects all the contexts where a contracted auxiliary have is used. So you can have could of, would of, should of, may of, might of, must of, and so forth. Right, an example is here. A rock would have treated me better, right? So if you it might look weird at the first glance, would of, but if you actually try to pronounce it just the way you would speak, it makes sense, because you would say something like I would have treated me better, right? Similarly, I should have graduated last semester. I could have used, you may have had, might have been, must have sprinkled, and so forth. So what you see here is that people write in a way that they think is correct, but it's actually incorrect. And this is not because they do not know how to, and the reason is the hypercorrectness, because they know that of should be used, should be written as of, and they overgeneralize. And something similar probably happened in the case of these his and her genitives in early modern English. Right, so purchases, pilgrims, Sejanus is fall, Ignatius's conclave. This us was reinterpreted as containing an H even though the H is not pronounced. And it also sort of makes sense because his pilgrims, his fall, his conclave, and so forth is something that makes sense semantically. And also, as I said, a similar construction can also be found in other Germanic languages. So this might as well be a natural development. Okay, but now let's get back to the last thing, what's up for next time. So next time we're going to talk about standard language ideology using the example of a text by George Putnam, The Art of English Poesy. And what I would like you to do is to have a look at the handout that you have on Blackboard and try to find answers to the following 5 questions, right? We're going to discuss these questions, or the answer to these questions, next week during our online session. So thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and